If it's unethical for citizens to kill one another, then it's also unethical for the state to kill citizens. Wait a minute. What if your execution is the just punishment, the commensurate punishment assigned by an institution that's a result of a democratically controlled and elected body of officials? What if you were judged by a jury of your peers in a fair trial? What if your execution is administered dispassionately and objectively? Those would be the differences between citizen-on-citizen killing and state executions. What I just gave and responded to is an example of one of the many bad arguments against the death penalty. It's one of the bad arguments that Jeffrey Reiman actually shows are poor very briefly in the opening paragraphs of his article against the death penalty. And then he goes on to offer what he thinks, what may be a decent argument against the death penalty. So I'm going to show you what these premises are in his argument, how they support this conclusion, and we'll see if this thing works overall. His first premise is that capital punishment is fully just, and it's just on grounds that it's consistent with lex talionis and the golden rule. Lex talionis just means an eye for an eye. And he thinks that both of these moral principles are a good thing, are objectively defensible because they suggest the equality and they reinforce the equality of individuals. To say that I should treat others the way that I want to be treated says something about the fact that your interests and others' interests and desires aren't any more important than my own. I shouldn't prioritize what's good for me over what's good for others because we're on par as human beings. Similarly, an eye for an eye suggests that, well, if I knock an eye out of your head, I deserve to have one knocked out of my head because the harm that I've inflicted upon you should be equal upon me because your eye is just as important to you as my eye is to me. So he thinks these are actually principles that we can endorse and that combined and together, we could argue that capital punishment is just. However, he adds the critical additional step that it's not unjust to punish less harshly. And he says that this is the case because, look, we don't torture torturers and we don't rape rapists. And we don't do those things on grounds that we're better than that. Even if it's the case that if a mass murderer, for example, captured his victims and tortured them before killing them, even if it's the case that an eye for an eye would suggest that we should torture him before he's punished further, we just refuse to do that because that's not something civilized people do. Similarly, with the case of rape, even if it's the case that a rapist deserves to have a similar, equally horrendous punishment inflicted upon them, we're better than that, and so we don't do it for those reasons. And this supports this conclusion that it's not unjust to punish more lightly. So he begins with that by conceding killing murderers is just, but it's not unjust to do less. He has to set the table for that. And this is represented simply by the lethal electric chair, which I don't think anybody does anymore, but or prison sentences. Both of them are just, but it's okay to do less than execution. Second principle, and this might be a surprising principle because it goes against what Reiman calls the argument from common sense. And the second premise is that capital punishment is no more a deterrent than life imprisonment or possibly even 20 years without parole. And what he wants to argue here is that when people who are considering murder think about the ramifications of their actions and they consider the punishment that the state may give them if they are caught, there are people that are going to be sufficiently deterred by life imprisonment or possibly even 20 years without parole that aren't going to be any more deterred by execution. And here's why. And we can see this in this illustration here. This isn't something that Reiman included. I just drew this. But each of these columns represents a person. And you can see these blue people down here. And these are all people that have considered murdering someone. And you can see the blue people down at the bottom, their motivation for murder never got very, very tall. So that's not very high on the, hey, I'm going to murder somebody scale. You can see that this red person, they were pretty motivated to murder. They weren't too worried about the risks, or they didn't have any personal moral objections. They didn't think they were going to get caught. They were irrational, whatever. So in any case, they're going to do the murdering regardless. These orange people, these are the people that are deterrable. This person's undeterrable. These people are deterrable. These people don't need a further state-inflicted deterrent. And these dashed lines here, these represent the different levels of deterrent that various punishments would have in the minds of these individuals, especially these two orange individuals right here. That first level at the bottom, that would be 20 years without parole. So that would be a pretty significant deterrent for most people, because you don't want to be stuck in prison. You want to be able to live your life, do what you want to do, and not be stuck in a cage with other people stuck in a cage. That second level, that's life imprisonment without parole. So 20 years is really, really bad. Life would be even worse. You have no hope of ever getting out. And then possibly this highest level would be execution. Reiman suggests, and he argues, that the level of deterrent that execution would impose would be pretty much on par with life imprisonment, and possibly just with that 20 years without parole. And if it was any more of a deterrent, it wouldn't be by very much. And so this is against that argument from common sense, and the argument from common sense is simply that the more harsh a punishment, the more effective a deterrent that we would expect it to be. But he's saying no, and that's because most people get stuck way down here. I shouldn't say get stuck. Most people, thankfully, don't get very far in their considering and their premeditation or whatever when it comes to potential murders. The people who do murder, in many cases, you're not going to be able to deter them regardless, because they just don't think they're going to get caught, or there's something wrong with them mentally. They're not really thinking through this in a rational fashion regardless. And those people who are deterrable, who if not for the state's threatening to punish them if they do it, the life imprisonment and possibly the 20 years would be effective enough. So that's premise number 2. Capital punishment is no more of a deterrent than life imprisonment. And I keep adding this qualifier because he does mention in the article that might be one thing to critique him on. Perhaps life imprisonment would be on par, or at least closer than would 20 years without parole, because that might be tolerable. Premise 3, though, and this is his real contribution and the most interesting and creative premise that I found, and one of my key takeaways. He argues that abolishing capital punishment would elevate our culture and decrease future murders. And so his argument here is that the state, through its laws and through its policies and through its practices, serves an educational function. It helps shape social culture. It helps shape social consciousness. It helps teach us, even though perhaps it shouldn't, what's morally acceptable and what's morally unacceptable. If you read the 3 Key Distinctions chapter from my Ethics in a Nutshell, you're going to see that the law is a very poor foundation for an ethical system. It's the case that good law tracks morality, but morality actually precedes law. But in any case, in practice, people do, in many cases, look to the law for signals as to what's permissible and what's impermissible. And so he argues that we've taken a principled stand against torturing torturers and raping rapists, and this has helped us to abhor and uphold our strong standards against those practices. And he thinks that if the state were to take a principled stand against killing persons, if the state were to say, no matter how heinous your crime, we're not going to kill a human being, that this would over time elevate our public respect for human life, would lead to a more harmonious society, which would, over time, decrease the number of murders. Now, Reiman's not a fool. He doesn't think that if the state banned capital punishment tomorrow, people that are career criminals and that are destined to become murderers would suddenly change their lives and become super wonderful, ethical, moral persons and hold hands and skip through daisies and whatnot. He doesn't think that's the case. But he does think that if the state were to say, we're not going to kill anyone, we respect life too much, that over time would make the society, make the culture much more, peaceful, harmonious, etc. So here, the deterrent argument for capital punishment, or for punishment generally, is that it gives people a negative reason not to murder. It scares them. Hey, you're thinking about murdering, don't do it or we'll punish you. Here it's more of a positive incentive, where the culture is shaped in a more forgiving, compassionate direction. And so he thinks that both of these things would contribute to a decrease in murder overall. The argument stands fine, I think, like this, without the 4th premise, but the 4th premise just adds insult to injury. And that 4th premise is that sentencing is oftentimes unfair on arbitrary grounds. And that unfairness comes in the form of the fact that when murderers are convicted, those who are poor or minorities are more likely to be sentenced to death, whereas those who are more affluent and white are less likely to be sentenced to death and are instead more likely to be sentenced to a prison term. Now, something I didn't mention just a second ago, I forgot to show you my visual aid for this. This is just representing the fact that in a society where executions are carried out, people are going to be more hateful and less forgiving and more angry, etc. And in a society where that's abolished and we simply have long prison sentences, we would be happier. So that's just something to visualize that. Oh, and I also forgot this second bullet right here. And that's the complementary argument that executing a person may not be a form of torture when the execution is carried out if it's painless, but it is a form of psychological torture, and it's a form of psychological torture on grounds that it's bad enough to simply be a mortal human being knowing that one day you're going to die, but whenever you also know that the state is the one that's going to kill you and there's a date on the calendar and your captors are the ones that are going to do it, it's dehumanizing, it's objectifying. The jailers are going to come to see you just as someone they should distance themselves from because they're housing you until you're executed. They're going to be a part of that. And so that constant dread is a form of psychological torture, and one of the additional reasons why we might want to abhor it and not do it, just out of the respect for humanity. But this last premise on the social injustice of executions, that just makes this stuff worse, that if we keep executions around, it's the case that minorities are going to be executed more often than non-minorities. And what's his conclusion? Those are the four premises. His conclusion is we should abolish and replace capital punishment or the death penalty with long prison sentences, perhaps life without parole, at least 20 years without parole. Now you may wonder, is Reiman really... Is he really appreciating the impact of murder and the wrongness and the awfulness of murder? Is he really appreciating what it means for a person's life to be cut short, the impact on their life, the impact on their loved ones, the suffering of their loved ones? Is he overly sympathizing with the plight of murderers of all people? Nowhere in the article does he use the word rehabilitation or the word forgiveness. And he says at the outset that it would be just to go ahead and execute murderers, but he gives us what seem to be some self-interested reasons to go ahead and do something else. He's like, look, it's not going to help us anymore if we execute people. And it's a good thing that we don't have to execute them to deter them, because if we don't execute them, we're also going to positively encourage them to not murder people. We're going to shape citizens' moral culture in that fashion, and so we'll have a happier society with less murder overall. So even though it would be just, it's in our interests to not do it, and if we did do it, it would also be socially unfair. Therefore, let's have long prison sentences instead. So there you go. As always, you decide, but there's his argument.